Hello and welcome to CMC. I'm Carol Looper. I'm a member of the board of the Columbus Metropolitan Club, and I am a retired television news reporter, although you never fully retire from reporting the news. I still watch it. I'm still in touch with my friends at the station, give them story ideas and so forth. Today, the Columbus Metropolitan Club presents What Changes If Climate Changes? A collaboration with the Columbus Dispatch Media Group and in partnership with the OSU Environmental Professionals Network. Each of our sponsors and partner are represented here today by many of their friends and associates. Please take a moment to thank them. Today's conversation will look to the future with the goal of providing some educated guesses, shall we say, of how climate change might affect our lives here in Ohio. Please welcome Professor of Entomology at the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center, College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences of OSU, Casey Hoy, Professor Assistant Dean for Global Public Health, College of Public Health, Qinghua Sun, Professor and State Climatologist at Geography and Byrd Polar and Climate Research Center at OSU, Bryan Mark, and our host, Science and Environment Reporter at the Columbus Dispatch, Marion Renault. Marion, the podium is yours.
All right. Thank you. I want to thank the Columbus Metropolitan Club for allowing me to host today's event, and of course this panel of experts who spend a lot of their time grappling with the question, what changes when climate changes? And I also want to thank all of you for coming, because this can be a confusing and difficult topic to engage with, but it is very crucial and important that we do so. So I'm sure you all know 2016 was the Earth's hottest year on record. In fact, all but one of the globe's 17 warmest years have happened since 2000. And here in Columbus, the climate has warmed faster than national and global rates over the last half century. Research models suggest that by 2095, which is about 80 years from now, our summers are going to be as hot as the summers in Arkansas. They also predict that we are going to be facing longer than usual dry spells that will be punctuated by intense storms, flash flooding, and that all of this is going to do things like attract new pests, species, and disease into the area and put stress on our infrastructure, our agriculture, our ecosystems, and our public health. So these are very wide-ranging topics and very serious in nature. Can we kind of start with that? Bryan, as the state climatologist, what do you see as some of the most pressing threats to Ohio right now?
Yeah, thanks, Marion. I think I would just concur that when we're looking at the future, it's going to be warmer and potentially an altered hydrologic regime. What does that mean? As you warm up the atmosphere, you can fit more moisture into it. It's not a linear, but it's an exponential change. And so when you start to think about this odd, maybe juxtaposition of drought and flooding, because you can get the air warmer, you're going to evaporate quicker and have drier spells, so longer intervals between rainfalls. When you have the rainfalls, they'll be more intense. And so you're going to have this then greater capacity to have intense downpours and less infiltration to the dry, hard-packed soil and more runoff and erosion. So there's potentially a lot of, even just from that statement, complications that you can extrapolate impact-wise to this basic region, which is highly agricultural, but it's also got a number of other infrastructural concerns that would happen. And you can imagine just looking at what happened in recent floods of epic proportion in Houston and other places to what this might mean for infrastructure, and then public health, as we'll get into, extrapolates from there. So yeah, if I could give that nugget, it would be as you warm the atmosphere, you're going to get more capacity to hold moisture, and you're going to also evaporate more, so you're going to have more drought and more flood.
I don't know if any of the other panelists would like to share what they personally find are some of the more pressing aspects of how climate change could affect us here in Central Ohio.
I'd be glad to pipe in here. One of the parts that's not in the bio is I lead the Initiative for Food and Agricultural Transformation, cultural with a capital C, at Ohio State, which is about food security, and the kind of regime that Bryan just talked about is very difficult to produce crops under. So when it's wetter when it's wet and drier when it's dry and no predictability about how you go back and forth, producing our food becomes very difficult. And some of the predictions in other parts of the country suggest that people will be moving back to Ohio from flooded coastal areas and areas with extreme drought. So I think in general, agriculture, food production, and food security become more challenging under these predictions.
So my research is more about air pollution and ambient temperature change on human health, both in human study and animal cell culture study. As we all know that air quality and climate change in terms of especially ambient temperature change actually can impact our human health status and also our disease development. We all know that it's strongly associated between air quality and asthma, especially in children, but that's way beyond asthma or respiratory diseases like cardiovascular disease, some cancer, even psychological disorders, developmental problems. So we can go on and on in addition to those traditional infectious diseases. So this does require a lot of coordination and research in order to provide those solid scientific evidences to the policymakers and to the citizens.
So climate change is an issue that does require a lot of evidence-based information. What, as researchers, what are questions that you still have or are trying to answer? And how do you hope that those answers might be applied to everyday life or to policymakers? Anyone, open to anyone.
I'm thinking of a study that was done by colleagues in Australia where they looked at some of the interactions between impacts on crops, the impacts on the pests that eat the crops, and then the impacts on the natural enemies of those crops. And what they found was that out of 22 potential impacts on the crops, there were 9, I think, that were bad for biological control of the insect pest, 4 or 6 that were good for biological control, and 7 to 9 that it could go either way. So their end conclusion was you could have more pest outbreaks or less pest outbreaks or no change in pest outbreaks. So I think, okay, well, that pretty well sums it up, doesn't it? And I think what you're going to find is that there's going to be a never-ending stream of research questions because these interactions that take place under the regime that we've talked about is going to be very difficult to figure out what are the end results. So I think you can expect more of those kinds of responses from scientists, as we just don't know until we are able to observe what the interaction looks like. We can come up with educated guesses, as you mentioned, about how we deal with those effects, but they are very difficult to predict in the first place. So a lot of what we're planning for is unpredictability.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would emphasize that observations are still a first-order priority. So it's underfunded. NSF and other agencies don't like to fund long-term observation networks in an environment where funding federal initiatives is kind of looked down upon. It's also a challenge to maintain. But one of the key variables that sort of integrates both the temperature and precipitation evapotranspiration signal is a soil moisture one. And that's one of the priority areas where we'd like to see existing networks expand a bit more. And so we're making a humble effort to try to coordinate around the state, including the OARDC's Mesonet, which is probably the best Mesonet or connection of weather stations that can then feed back to inform federal policy through model output. Better equip those with communication networks and soil moisture sensors because it's an integrated variable. Is impacted by a lot of these. So we could draw a lot of differential equations and show this, but when you have a very complex, interactive ecosystem response, it's very difficult to say exactly what will happen. I would add that the other big uncertainty is just what we're going to decide to do. That has a huge impact as to where we end up on the projection for climate change. So those uncertainties are really difficult to handle because they come down to political decisions right, and infrastructural ones. So anticipating an envelope of change, but then also being diligent to get good data is kind of the challenge that we're walking through.
And part of, right, this threat is that we're sort of doing an experiment of sorts with the climate. So the conditions of our questions are always changing. I wonder, can you go into some of the thresholds that we've already passed, or, you know, ways in which we can kind of anchor ourselves in the present? You know, what is certain at this point? What do we still not know? I don't know if maybe Bryan, that might be.
Those are, again, tricky, but yeah, if we stopped all output of greenhouse gas production, you may have heard this already, we'd still increase temperatures a good degree, centigrade, just in the inertia within the system. So that's an unrealistic goal, obviously. So where we end up projecting temperature change as the big, often focused on variable, is fairly robustly concluded that we're going to go up. How high we go, it depends on what we do. But threshold-wise, there's thresholds that we're rediscovering for resiliency in ecosystems because of these interactions that are very difficult to see or model unfold. But we've already passed 400 parts per million in CO2. We're not likely to see that threshold go below that in our lifetimes.
And what's important about that particular threshold?
Well, that number is far beyond anything we've seen in the ice core record, which is our paleo air measurements that go back almost 1 million years, 850,000 years on a global basis. So we pushed ourselves into a realm of CO2 which is not unprecedented in the Earth history, but you have to go back millions of years to get there, and it was a very different world with radically different sea level and boundary conditions at that point. So we're going into kind of a no analog scenario because it's the rate change that we're pushing the system to then compare against background evidence that we have from the historical record.
Can I add one point?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, I think one of the things that we do know is things like, well, when I first got to OARDC in the last millennium, the time that you brought Mom to the Seacrest Arboretum to see the flowering crab apples was Mother's Day, which was perfect. It's now early April. It used to be that in Ohio, in Northeast Ohio, when you did maple syrup, you had to be ready to go by mid-March. It's now, if you're not ready by the 1st of January, you're not going to get your maple syrup. So we already have changes that are taking place in agriculture and the way we produce. I realized I painted kind of a stark picture a little while ago. So the good news is that we're used to dealing with this kind of thing. So every day at ports of call like Miami and Los Angeles, there are inspectors looking for new insect and disease problems that are trying to arrive from the rest of the world all the time. And they're constantly finding them. Every now and then one slips through. So a good example is emerald ash borer, which was brought in from Eastern Asia on packing crates to the Detroit airport. It is now killing every ash tree in its path as it moves south. And the good news is, again, that we have experience with how to detect and deal with these kind of things and mount a response. And so that's why we have public land-grant universities like The Ohio State University, departments of entomology, and programs that really are prepared for dealing with change.
And this is a topic that I think can be very overwhelming to hear all of the possible outcomes and all of the possible things that might be awaiting us in the coming decades. Do you have advice for individuals, or we can start there, for individuals with things that they can do to play their part in trying to reduce those emissions, or any advice for people at home who feel this and feel scared and overwhelmed and want to have something that they can do to not feel so helpless?
So in terms of individual activity involvement, I think depends on how you look at climate change as a big picture. I think this, not in theory, but in practical way, that I think it's everybody can and should be involved. Even something happened far away, let's say the polar region, I think we all contribute proportionally to that kind of change. I just talked over the table, seeing that, for example, if we change our daily lifestyle, we could also reduce those kind of green gas emission, reduce the energy consumption, and indirectly contribute to the global, no matter temperature change or air quality improvement. So that's my take.
And what kind of daily habits can do that sort of thing?
Well, for example, we certainly we can take less elevators if the condition allows. At the same time, to save the energy, electricity, but also exercise. That's benefit ourselves. We can walk more, drive less if the distance is relatively short. We can reuse recycle a lot of things, plastic bag, bottles. So a long list of things we can think about that and get actively involved in it.
I like to remind students when they ask me this that the best thing you can do is get to just talk about this with your elected officials. And I ask around the room how many people know who your representatives are, and I get maybe less than 1% raising their hand. And so there's a sense, I think, in fact, it's reflected in a poll that was done in 2013 of Ohioans and Columbus people, that only about 5% think this is something we can actually make an impactful difference in. And I mean, there's a disconnect for what we actually can do within our elected democracy, republicanism, whatever you want to call it. I'm not a very good poli-sci guy, but my 2-cent definition on poli-sci is it's allocation of resources, and if you can get out there and make a voice heard through calling and talking to people and engaging with the issue, but also through your pocketbook and the decisions you make and how you spend your money, those can have big impacts. But I think that's a really good point. You can make interconnections in your life, because this is a very interconnected theme ecologically, about how you can connect the dots between I got to walk more because we're sitting ourselves to death, I got to reduce my emissions and live closer to my work, and where I do my stuff, maybe I could walk more and make some critical decisions that way and consume less. But it is overwhelming. I don't disagree.
Yeah.
So picking up on that theme, I think you can plant a garden, because that's good for you, it's good for your family, you're more likely to be more self-sufficient for your own food. You also tend to recognize that it's not easy to produce food, so you have a greater appreciation for the people that do that for a living, that do it full time, are more likely to seek out people nearby that do that. Potential for shortening supply chains, creating more resilience, more diversity in our agricultural production system. It does take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it in the soil. That's a good thing. But when you're out there, you should protect yourself from mosquitoes in the evening.
And I'm glad you brought up some polling information, because I did want to ask you guys, a majority of Ohioans believe that climate change is happening, and believe more than half are convinced that it's driven by mostly human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, but only about 1 in 3 Ohioans believes that climate change will harm them or affect them personally. Experts obviously say that it undoubtedly will. Once people accept climate change, how do you take them to the next level to where they can understand the impacts it will have on their lives? Is there any particular impact of climate change that you think resonates with Ohioans, or anything you can share for those who believe that it is happening but don't quite yet understand what that means for them?
Well, I like to engage in conversations, and what we've been trying to do in the SCU, the State Climate Office of Ohio, is going and talking to farmers. That's one of our important stakeholders, and just asking about how they're experiencing changes. And once we do that, the conversation really takes a new direction, rather than trying to say, hey, climate change is real and this is how it's going to impact you. Because they're already seeing changes, and we can have an interesting dialogue around that. I've already had 2 conversations today with people in this room. One was mentioning how people are washing up more frequently in her backyard because of flooding in rivers. I mean, that's a very real change in the state. As you shift the mean state, the tails on that distribution, okay, because the weather's still going to be highly variable, are going to shift. So the extremes are going to be more frequent. And so how do we prepare for that is, thinking about these extremes. And so also with where are you going to plan your next house? Are you going to build within 10 feet of that 100-year floodplain? Was another question I had already. And this comes down to evaluating the information that you have at hand, realizing, well, what's a recurrence interval? When I say 100-year flood, that's based on historical data. Okay, and so it's a probability statement, but if we're entering a new realm of possible shift in that extreme state, those probabilities will shift. And so what are you willing to incur as a risk? And if you can bring it right down to those pocketbook decisions at a personal level, I think it makes it real.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is bring it to home to where people live. So people do tend to notice things like the shifts in flowering of plants and when you get maple syrup and things like that. So that makes it real that things are changing, but those things are not immediately seen as big threats. The cartoon version of climate change is typically the SUVs belch out exhaust fumes, and then it traps heat, and things get hotter, and there's clouds of mosquitoes carrying deadly tropical diseases, and they bite you and you die. Well, it hasn't happened to them or anybody they know, so that one's kind of hard for folks to believe. But I think if you do focus in on some of these extreme events, I mean, what's going on right now in Houston and is being followed by the biggest hurricane ever recorded, those kind of things should get your attention. And even though that's not hitting us right now, we're not immune from those kinds of disruptions in our lives. So I think you could both create empathy with what's going on where people are really in the crosshairs of climate change, and also remind that there are these extreme events that are hitting us, and that predictions are that that continues to increase.
And with the wildfires out west and the hurricanes in the south right now, I think a lot of Ohioans are wondering, is there any kind of extreme event that Ohio could be facing in the coming decades? Is there any sort of extreme weather event threat here?
Yes.
And what,
So-
what that might look like.
I would say, again, it's the hydrologic extremes that are going to be the most impactful and costly. So more prolonged drought could be a real problem, as could be floods. And so the shift in those two are really big and impactful. We'd also potentially see more destructive storm events. And what would that look like? And how do we become prepared for that? So those are all very real. What's interesting is when you look at the actual data and see how temperatures are changing by season, it's the warmer temperatures at the cold seasons that are changing much more rapidly than in the warm season. And we're actually looking at a future that could have more humidity and cloudiness, and therefore actually slightly lower temperatures during the growing season, and warmer temperatures during that frost-free season that kills the pests. So that's where a lot of these ecological things and considerations come into play, and that's the background state. And you introduce then, say, an abrupt frost after you've already had this early blooming, and the damage could be even more intense. So all those kind of combinations.
Yeah, especially where you're dependent on local supplies for these kinds of things. I guess I was going to say anything that affects transportation is an immediate threat. We're already one of the worst states in the nation for household food insecurity rates. We're like 5th from the bottom. That was in the dispatch. And the Mid-Ohio Food Bank and our colleagues there are a logistics operation. So a lot of what they're doing is responding to daily emergencies for over 100,000 people throughout central Ohio. So if you have one of these extreme events, especially one that cuts transportation out, that's what they're dealing with in Houston right now, is in the aftermath of the storm, moving food to where people need it. So if you have this combination of the emergency food supplies are now perishable because people need them every day, plus you don't have the way to move things when there really is an emergency, now you're at great risk.
So in the future, do you imagine that we're just going to be continually in that state of emergency, or is there any way to change practices or infrastructure so that that's not a constant battle?
I would hope we're smart enough to start planning for that now.
Because that is one of the challenges of climate change, is that the real impacts are so far away that it can be very difficult to convince lawmakers or to convince the right people to make those long-term investments. But maybe you guys might have some ideas for, in an ideal world, how would Columbus, Central Ohio, become resilient, and what kinds of long-term planning would that require?
I would say diversifying portfolio is a good idea. I mean, I do agree that we are very adaptable, and I'm optimistic about our creative endeavors in that realm. But when it comes to gaining resiliency, I think thinking through carefully some of the probabilities and risk calculations about what we're willing to invest and when in these scenarios is a kind of tedious but important step in this. And I would just want to make a plug for Jason Cervenek, who's over here at this table, who's part of a climate change adaptation task force to look at compiling a report. They're busily writing, actually, up the results about what we can do to be much better adapted in these kind of probability spaces of what would likely to happen.
And what kinds of things are those? Is it, cooling centers? Is it for those hot days? Do you have any specific examples of the types of things that we are lacking right now that in the future we should have prepared in order to be resilient?
Well, maybe I should let you have a little word in for public health, but I would suggest that you all have a postcard on your table about this. Some of the, again, increase in temperature and precip intensification, the impacts and actions that are likely and hopeful to take are there. But some examples might be thinking about how do we protect the infrastructure in this logistics-intense region for better resiliency against extremes. Okay, can we deepen the retention ponds? Can we make more sensible interactions with the floodplain without low-head dams that could pile up potential and burst, with maybe a more ecological design for increased infiltration of waters? Those would be some examples about making some cost-effective measures that are more of a win-win across a broader view of the economy. Cooling centers, I'm not so sure of, but maybe that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I think in terms of that, it requires comprehensive planning from the global perspective to the individual. We all need to. I think in order to address that, let me give example. I think I have to clarify that the impact of climate change, no matter on the environment, on the earth, on human health, is not far away. It's happening. It has been happening. It's just how you realize how serious that is. So the example I gave that to you is we always talk about the comparison or the difference between how we remember our family doctor, clinician who treats us whenever we get a physical examination and a disease, and we seldom, if not at all, remember who innovate a vaccine that saved millions, if not billions of people. I think that could be the difference in how we see the importance of preventing the seriousness of climate change, the consequences happening. It's like how we prevent the disease, no matter a cardiovascular disease or certain cancer happening. And in my classroom, I always challenge my student. One of the questions is, when would be the best time to do something to prevent cardiovascular diseases? We all know that cardiovascular diseases like hypertension, like stroke, even recent like obesity, type 2 diabetes, they are the diseases, they are chronic diseases that's mostly happening in the senior population, like people are perhaps more than 60, even 70 years old. So my question to my students who are about 20 years old, even less, so when should we start to do something? Even, here there are a lot of parents. When do you help or do something to your children to prevent their future in order, not to get or delay the cardiovascular disease? And a lot of time, my student couldn't answer that correctly. So basically, the science evidence is saying that as early as possible, even, during the neonatal time period, the parents should do something to prevent them for future cardiovascular disease. I think that principle applies to how to deal with climate change.
And just for our audience, what is the relationship between, climate change and public health, and maybe even individual health? How do you connect your own personal health to what is going on in the climate?
Okay. So previously we already mentioned that there are existing infectious diseases that may exacerbate it. There are some perhaps new infectious diseases coming from other regions in the world. I think we already know a lot about malaria, other infectious diseases that would certainly impact the area, the regions in the past never occurred. But also, I think here I have been thinking that since I got this invitation, I think there is a significant lack research knowledge about the climate change on chronic, non-communicable diseases. The impact is tremendous. I always make a joke in my classroom, but it's not a joke. I said, most of us, if not all of us, one day will die from chronic disease. We are not going to die from infectious disease. So that, I think, really, especially for our country, United States, we need to do more research, to share more knowledge about especially those climate change impact our non-communicable diseases like cancer, like cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, go on and on. I think that's very, very important.
So I would agree with the idea of planning with eyes wide open, and for what you do understand. But I'm with Brian on the that there's a lot that you cannot plan for. So from what my understanding is, Houston was very careful planning for storms like Hurricane Harvey, but it turned out to be a much bigger storm than they had planned for, and so they're scrambling now to deal with that. So we have to accept that there are going to be things that that we really just can't plan for, and then what makes systems, and this is kind of general systems talk, but what makes systems resilient is the diversity, the capacity for adaptation, and self-organization. So when I think of diversity in terms of what we can do to prepare, it's diversity across the entire food system. Production, the storage, the processing, the transportation, so that if you have enough diversity there, there's always something that works if you've been hit by something like Hurricane Harvey. And then the other side, the self-organization, is the idea that we are all in this together and we can help each other when these kinds of things happen. My favorite current example is the Cajun Navy, which I have all kinds of imagination about how that works, and it may be very well organized, but I'm guessing it's a lot of people saying, time to put a boat on the trailer and get down to Texas because they need some help down there.
And it is 12:55, so we will move to the audience questions in a few minutes. So if anyone has something they'd like to ask any of our experts, don't be shy. There is a microphone over here. Please step up and start to form your question. But I did want to ask you guys, have any of you had experience recently with skeptics and people who are still not convinced that climate change is real or caused by humans? And when you are confronted with that attitude or that belief, what is your approach? How do you bridge that gap for those people?
Yeah, I've had a lot of this recently. In fact, my daughter pulled me aside after church the other day when she said, "Daddy, that conversation didn't sound like a church conversation that you just had." And this was after giving a talk about global climate change to a Sunday school class, and there was somebody who just confronted me on everything and was not going to be convinced by more evidence. And I think that's the level where we're at sort of an interesting psychological realization of tribalism at one level, but how we say what we say matters, that we're not going to see eye to eye on the facts. So I try to find some common ground. And I find that finding a dialogue in my story and just sharing how I got to this point and going forward about my observations was something that we could then go forward with. And I also made the decision not to leave that church, and I could have. I may in the future, but at this point I haven't. So it's a commitment to a community. I think one of the things that breaks down in what we're seeing in our day and age, where we get everything from our own custom news source and just blast hyperbole at one another, is this lack of community engagement, just simply talking to your neighbor.
Are there any questions that you get a lot? Because I know that as part of your job, you do a lot of outreach, and you do speak with people who have a lot of questions about the science behind climate. Is there any question that you get a lot?
Well, isn't it natural? Isn't it the sun? This is all a bunch of bunk, and a lot of it comes down to how we want to allocate resources, but looking at the evidence critically. And what I try to say is, this is a testable hypothesis. This is science. You can go and test this. We will find some answers down the road. We don't have any better explanation, and I try to turn the table and ask them what they see as a good explanation and find some evidence-based reasoning. I then try to get them thinking about making their own observations and make a plug for the COCO RAS. So I'd make a plug to everybody here to get out there and measure precipitation, one of the most spatially heterogeneous variables. And it's a community collaborative rain, hail, and snow network where you can actually start to get empowered by looking at your own rainfall and seeing how it changes, and feed that into a national network. Those are my efforts. I really do believe it's kind of, I feel small in this arena too, but I think if we can make it real and talk about just how this impacts us, it makes a big difference. So anyway, those are some of the questions and ways I deal with it.
I find typically it's not even so much denying that climate change is occurring, because you can get into some of these observations. There's a similar network for plant flowering times, and it's very clear that things are changing, and often that's not really the question. The question is more, what should we do about it, and at what level? And that's the basis for a very honest conversation. What should we do about it? How much do we care about our neighbors who are really being badly affected by this? And I think that's really where the conversation needs to be.
I always ask that the statement should be supported by the evidences. In medicine, in public health, we call it evidence-based medicine. So if I meet somebody who doesn't believe something, then show the evidences you think it's not occurring. So I think that's the easy way to engage in discussion.
And with that, I think we will open it up to audience questions.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Yeah.
Andy Campbell. My question is, there's been a lot of conversation, Elon Musk and others, that we're going to save civilization by colonizing and terraforming Mars. It would seem a lot easier if humans cause global warming that we could come up with some technological solutions just to turn the temperature down on Earth. Is that a possibility in our future, that we'll be able to do some things technologically to help us in all of these ways?
Yeah, there are. It's called geoengineering, is kind of the general field of this inquiry. How can we maybe put up smart dust in the atmosphere that we could, this is my dad's favorite, he's an MIT guy, where we could just, like a thermostat, dial the reflectivity of dust in the stratosphere and reflect more of the incoming solar radiation to cool the planet. The other one is to put up sulfate aerosols, like fake volcanoes. The other ones are to actually sequester more carbon out of the atmosphere. So there's two general types. One is to reflect incoming energy. The other one is to sequester more carbon and try to reduce the greenhouse effect. Huge costs, lots of unconstrained variables. Who gets to control that thermostat, right? These are huge questions, and ones that really have derailed a lot of this discussion, but it's gaining more practical foothold as people realize that the political arena is at a loggerheads, and it may just be an inevitability that we'll see some of this stuff coming up in the future.
The one place where I'd take a little bit of exception is the huge cost of taking carbon out of the atmosphere, because plants do that, and they do it pretty much for free. So they're all doing it out there, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and it winds up in the soil. We have a colleague in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, Dr. Ratan Lal, who's a world expert on carbon sequestration in soils. And so that is an opportunity if we really pay attention to how we're managing landscapes, agricultural lands, for sequestering carbon as a way of reducing the carbon in the atmosphere.
That was a partial answer to my question.
Sorry, if you don't mind sharing your name.
I will.
Yep.
My name is Warren Fishman, and my question is that there are 300 million people in the United States, but there's 7 billion people in the world, and I'm very encouraged that people like you are thinking about it and trying to do something about it. But what is the percentage, or what are we doing what are the other countries doing? What are the other people doing? Are we the most active population in studying global warming, or are we getting a lot of help from the rest of the world?
There are a lot of international efforts. You probably heard about the Paris Accord to try to come up with an international agreed limit of carbon emissions. There are really big technological advances going on in China around solar and energy innovations. There's a lot of activity in other parts of the world that defy, trying to limit carbon. And so there's a lot of discussion that I get in circles about, well, it's all about this economy, and we can't just be part of the one small component trying to limit carbon. But yes, collectively, this is one of those tragedy of the common scenarios. I mean, the atmosphere is something we've all taken for granted, and we just can move stuff in and out of it, but it goes global, and what we do here does impact people. And so trying to shift that conversation into how we can self-limit but also organize a limit is the international political domain. But again, that gets into politics that's beyond my remit. It is possible, but...
Yeah, I would say that particularly in academic circles, it is a global focus to help humanity. And when I say we're all in this together, I do mean all the 7 billion, not just the 300 million in the United States. So I think it is a very active area of research and planning across the globe. As Brian points out, there are political issues that interfere with that.
I also think it's worth noting that this country is among the highest in terms of carbon emissions. So although there might be 300 million Americans in a 7 billion planet, we output much more carbon emissions than a lot of other countries.
Especially when you look at per capita emissions.
Yeah.
China does emit more. I get this one a lot. But if you break it down per capita, we're on the top of the list.
Right. And the impacts are a lot more severe in other places than the United States right now.
All right, next question.
Yes, and if you look at historic emissions, we dwarf any other country in the world. I'm David Scott, past president, current board member of the National Sierra Club. My comment, and I'm kind of looking to see if any of you can confirm this, my understanding is that we actually have hard empirical data that we're getting more gully washers now, that rainfall in Ohio is more likely to come in the kind of gully washers we're seeing. And that one of the most noticeable impacts when you talk about climate change happening here and now is in what's happening in Lake Erie. Because these extreme gully washers and the extreme rainfall events are washing fertilizer and phosphorus and manure that formerly would have stayed in the soil directly into the western basin of the lake. And it's my understanding that that is true, and I don't know if there are any comments or verification for that, but that we've got hard data showing that we're getting harder rain events that are directly impacting this terrible nutrient pollution problem.
Yeah, you definitely are right. We tried to give you a visual of one of those factoids on this postcard on the table, which tells you that increasing heavy precipitation has gone up by 32%, and that's specifically the number of days per year that saw more than 1.25 inches of precip, and that's increased by 78% from the 1951 to 2012 baseline. And absolutely there's a connection from runoff, intense rainfall to runoff to Lake Erie and harmful algal blooms. One of the ways we're trying to get on board with this, by the way, our mission as the State Climate Office of Ohio is to connect people and climate information to improve outcomes. And so the ways we see this transformative information gathering is to try to get better forecasts as to when you apply your fertilizer. You shouldn't do it within 24 hours of intense rainfall. But getting that information at the right time to the right people at the field-specific locations is kind of the challenge. So yes, that is a big deal, and it is interrelated, and the ecology of that all the way down to the Gulf dead zones is well known, right?
It is. I have to admit up front, I'm not an expert on the algal blooms in Lake Erie or the phosphorus runoff, but the data that I've seen indicated it's a lot more complex than strictly the pipeline from gully washer to erosion to phosphorus in Lake Erie. There are a lot of complexities in the root of the phosphorus, where it is, how it is in the soil, and the impact of rainfall, not just in amount, but in the quality. over time.
And when it comes to climate change and algal blooms, another important factor is the heating of Lake Erie. Those warmer waters create a better environment for that cyanobacteria. So it's not just the nutrient runoff, it'll also be those warmer temperatures that'll affect the rate and the intensity of algal blooms, which, as an added note, some models suggest that we could see a doubling of the really big blooms in the coming decades. But again, with the right kind of mitigation, it may not come to that. So, all right, next question.
Hi, I'm Alice Fraser, Delaware, Ohio. I guess this is more of a political question, but I mean, Denmark is going to almost 100% renewables for their electricity source. Germany's making big strides in that direction. The Netherlands. Do you have any insight or know anybody who's studying why there's so much political resistance in this country to doing what should be a no-brainer? This is an obvious problem. We need to start on a solution yesterday. And, so I realize none of you are politicians, but do you have some kind of insight or comments about that?
I actually might be able to take this one. Political scientists that I've talked to say that what's unique in the U.S. is that there's been, over decades, climate change and environmental policy has really become a litmus test for politics. Asking someone how they feel about environmental issues, hearing their response tells you a lot about which party they belong to, and that's an identity that's developed over decades. And you just don't necessarily see that kind of politicization of environmental issues in other countries. So I think it has a lot to do with, something that I hear again and again is that, that Nixon created the EPA. It wasn't always, some of these issues were not always political, but over time they have totally become a litmus test of American politics. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
I would just say thank you, Marion.
All right, another question?
My name is Bill Wayhoff with Steptoe and Johnson PLC. I have to go to Washington, D.C. next week. I have the option to drive, or I can fly in a passenger jet. Which should I do? It's just a regular car. It's not a Tesla or anything. So can any of the scientists tell me which I should do to reduce my carbon footprint?
I'm afraid this is a moral quandary that you'll have to wrestle with by yourself.
So in that case, I will just offer that I think the big controversy arose when the carbon taxes came into discussion. So when people start having to pay for this, because some people think that that's not a tax that they should have to pay, that's the genesis, I think, of a lot of the controversy. So it's not just a philosophical discussion. It's about carbon taxes. So think about that.
It's also about putting the right price on this common resource that we have. And so there's a lot of very conservative people forwarding this idea that the problem is a broken market. We just haven't put the right price on this, and there are very conservative solutions. Bob Inglis would be someone to go look up. He's been here. He was in the House of Representatives, got voted out for not voting for the troop surge and for coming clean as believing climate change is real and caused by humans. But he now has a very progressive agenda in forwarding this idea that there are conservative solutions to this issue if we put the right price tag on carbon.
Thank you.
I'm going to take advantage of my place here and ask a question from the podium. My community recycles, and I recycle paper, plastic, bottles, cardboard. I don't use the bags that people bring to the grocery store to avoid the use of plastic and paper bags. Is there any measurement? Is there any data to let me know, does anything help that we as individuals, little tiny individuals, do in recycling to make a difference? Have you seen data on that?
I can't speak for data, but there is a certain logical aspect of that. If every person kind of took that perspective and everyone stopped recycling, that would be of huge impact. It's one of those areas that depends on everyone assuming that their small role is important. You know, it's a completely communal mission. So, but I don't know about the data.
Well, there's a number of scary data emerging at the size of plastic islands in the mid-oceanic gyres that are the size of Texas. Plastic doesn't degrade, but it ends up throughout the ecosystem. So those numbers compound, and you can start to put a real other dimension to what the implications of our choices are.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, there are some of these online footprint calculators that you can, I mean, if you're really looking for a way of comparing two options, but I agree with Marion, a certain amount of it is just logic, and if you can reduce the amount of waste, then the bags become irrelevant and the like. Estimates are somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of our food is wasted, and at the same time we're very food insecure. So just reducing the amount that is stored in large refrigerators and going to waste is one of the really easy things you can do.
And sorry, one last thing, because it hasn't been mentioned yet, but I'm almost certain that one of the biggest sources of pollution and carbon emissions is making sure that you get rid of appliances and electronics properly, and also transitioning to plant-based diets are also big switches that people can make that do have serious impact in terms of reducing emissions.
Thank you, and I hope you all enjoyed today's forum. You can view and share today's forum and all of our forums on CTV, Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website. Just go to YouTube. Let's thank our collaborators, Columbus Dispatch and OSU Environmental Professionals Network. And of course, our speakers, Casey Hoy, Qinghua Sun, Brian Mark, and Marion Renault. Thank you, and I hope to see you here next week.